תודה רבה לרביעיית הסקסופונים של הקונסרבטוריום העירוני הרצליה, בהדרכתו של יובל טצ'ניק. תודה רבה לכם. אנחנו שמחים להתחיל את היום השני. המושב הראשון יהיה מושב מיוחד לציון תום עידן מעבורות החלל. ינחה אותו פרופסור חיים אשד. פרופסור חיים אשד, בבקשה.
Boker Tov. Good morning to all the distinguished guests. Rona Ramon. I'll switch to Hebrew with your permission. ב-30 השנים שבהם מעבורת החלל שימשה כרכב חללי לשימוש חוזר, הנדסת החלל השתנתה בצורה מדהימה והביאה כל מיני תוצאות שאנחנו משתמשים בהן כיום. הוכח שניתן לשגר אסטרונאוטים לביצוע משימות מגוונות בחלל, מאינטגרציית מכלולים ועד לעבודות תיקון ושיפוץ, גם של לוויינים בחלל וגם של המעבורת הבינלאומית, תחנת החלל הבינלאומית. הוכח גם שמעבורות החלל ניתן לשגר מהן לוויינים מכל מיני סוגים לכל מיני מסלולים, וגם לעלות בעזרת המעבורת מטענים כבדים לחלל, וגם להחזיר מטענים מהחלל לכדור הארץ. ובנוסף הוכח גם שניתן לתדלק, זה היה פעם החלום שלנו, לוויינים שלנו גמרו לעבוד לא בגלל שקרה להם משהו, פשוט נגמר הדלק. אז הוכח בעזרת המעבורת שניתן לתדלק לוויינים בחלל, וגם לעלות הספקה בכמויות גדולות מאוד, במשקל כבד, שאין לו עדיין תחליף במשגר אחד יחיד. ב-18 ליוני 1983, האסטרונאוטית סלי רייד הייתה לאישה הראשונה מארצות הברית ששוגרה לחלל עם צוות מעבורת הצ'לנג'ר, ותקופה חדשה התחילה שבה אסטרונאוטיות נוספות טסו לחלל וביצעו משימות מאוד מרשימות. עכשיו, לפני עידן המעבורות, כל הדברים האלה לא היו מובנים מאליהם, וכל הפעילויות לגבי אפשרות של פעילות אסטרונאוטים בחלל לא היו ודאיים. ועם עידן המעבורות, המשימות האלה נראות כמובנות מאליהן, ופעילות בחלל נראית אפשרית ומבטיחה, בוודאי כשהתכנון הוא טיסות מאוישות למאדים, ואני מאמין שנגיע לכך. כמובן, עם הדברים הטובים, לא כל יעדי התכנון של המעבורות הושגו, כמו מחיר נמוך לכל שיגור, וגם קצב שיגור המעבורות היה נמוך במידה משמעותית מהתכנון, וכמובן גם מחיר הפיתוח ולוח הזמנים, כמו שאנחנו מכירים מ-30 שנות חלל בישראל, חרג הן במחיר והן בלוח הזמנים. זה חלק מהפולקלור של פיתוח מערכות חלל. אבל עם כל זאת, לדעתי, מעבורת החלל הוא הכלי המתוחכם והמרהיב ביותר ששימש בעצם ככלי תעבורה. הייתי שמח אם הוא היה ממשיך לשמש, הוא כלי מדהים, מכדור הארץ לחלל וגם מהחלל לכדור הארץ, הבאת לוויינים ומטענים. הוא סלל גם את הדרך, העידן הזה, לפיתוחים נוספים עתידיים בתחומי הטכנולוגיה והמדע בחלל, וגם האיץ את פיתוח התיירות העתידית מכדור הארץ לחלל, שאני מקווה שתתחיל עוד השנה עם וירג'ין גלקטיק, ויש עוד שורה של חברות, בעיקר חברות פרטיות שנכנסו לתחום הזה, אבל כל הנושאים האלה יורחבו על ידי המרצים בפאנל הזה. המרצה הראשון הוא האסטרונאוט ביל מקארטר מנאסא. ביל הוא אלוף משנה, אצלנו נהוג לומר אלוף משנה במיל, לא יודע איך זה בארצות הברית, אבל הוא אחד הווטרנים. יש לו מעל 9,000 שעות טיסה ב-41 כלי טייס וחלל שונים. בשנת 73 ביל קיבל תואר BSc בהנדסה מהאקדמיה בווסט פוינט, וב-83 הוא קיבל מאסטר MSc באווירונאוטיקה וחלל. ביל חבר בשורה ארוכה של ארגונים בתחומי החלל והאווירונאוטיקה, ורשימת תארי הכבוד שלו ארוכה ומרשימה ודורשת לא מעט זמן רק להקריא אותה, אז אני מתנצל לפניו שאני לא מקריא את כל הרשימה כי זה יגמור לנו את כל הזמן. הוא הוסמך כטייס ב-1976, הוא שימש כראש צוות טיסה בקוריאה, וב-1987 הוא הוסמך כטייס ניסוי ושימש גם פרופסור חבר בווסט פוינט. הוא הוסמך כאסטרונאוט ב-91 ונתן חלק ב4 משימות לחלל, שעה כ-225 ימים בחלל, כולל כ-25 שעות במשימות מחוץ לחללית והליכה בחלל, מה שנקרא extra-vehicular activity. Bill, please, the list is long, so please come to the podium.
Thank you, Professor Shedd. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And Professor Shedd, thank you very much. You're absolutely correct. The space shuttle was truly a remarkable vehicle. Rona, distinguished guests, my wife and I are just so honored to be able to join you at the Ilan Ramon Space Conference. 30 years of human spaceflight. So what really has been the impact of the space shuttle program? You know, the space shuttle program started, as Professor Shedd said, with very, very significant goals. And we set for ourselves very ambitious targets. And it turned out, as in any ambitious endeavor, that the realization was sometimes beyond the reach of current technology. But look at some of the things that we decided that we were going to try to do. 65,000 pounds, over 30,000 kilos to orbit, 500 flights per airframe, self-ferry using air-breathing engines. And we discovered we couldn't quite achieve all of those goals. But here were some of the things the challenges that we had. The thrust profiles, having engines that we had, liquid engines that we were throttling. The requirement that we needed to be able to return to the launch site if there were an ascent abort. And then we discovered we had performance gaps. There was a place in which we couldn't return to Florida, but we also, due to the performance limitations of the engines, we couldn't get to orbit. So we then had to add a transatlantic abort landing scenario. The main engines were behind schedule from the very start. An extraordinary challenge, these very high pressure liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen engines. The thermal protection system, the tiles required to protect the shuttle during entry, just getting them to stick was more difficult than we anticipated. And as Professor Shedd pointed out, when you have delays, costs increase. But it worked. What a magnificent vehicle. The engines, although not as powerful as the Saturn engines, are the most efficient liquid fuel engines ever built, liquid fuel rocket engines ever built and flown. And we still have those. We have the ability, we have preserved about a dozen of those engines, and they are available for use in future missions. And the heat-resistant tiles, they're extraordinary. When we produce them, we put them in a kiln and heat them up to thousands of degrees. And you can then take one and hold it by the corners, and it's glowing red hot, and there is no heat transmitted to your fingertips. So what are some of the accomplishments of the space shuttles? Routinely flew at hypersonic speeds, Mach 25. As I mentioned, the most efficient chemical rocket engines ever built. The largest solid rocket engines that were ever flown. The vehicle was reusable. And now here's I think a really significant point which I'll build on later. 355 different people flew into space on the space shuttle. That's almost 70% of all human beings who've ever left the atmosphere. It carried more than 50% of all mass ever put into space by anyone. And then, of course, we had the great successes of the great observatories, such as the Hubble Space Telescope, which Professor Weissman briefed us on yesterday. And, as we all know, there are many languages in the world, and NASA has its own. Largest, fastest winged vehicle in history. And if we ever can actually have routine, scheduled hypersonic flight, which will shrink the world significantly, it will be significantly based on what we learned from the space shuttle. Shuttle achievements. A very capable vehicle. We launched multiple satellites, and as you can see, in the years before the Challenger accident, we deployed 20 commercial satellites from the space shuttle. Servicing missions, repairing the Hubble or repairing disabled satellites, and perhaps in the future, refueling satellites using the next generation of vehicles. And this was not an American program. Certainly the vehicle has USA on the side, but from very early on, it was an international program deploying planetary probes such as Galileo and Ulysses, the Gamma Ray Observatory, the first alpha magnetic spectrometer, and the Hubble Space Telescope, all with significant partnership from other nations. One of my favorites was ESA's Space Lab. Space Lab had different configurations. One was a big laboratory module that we as crew members could go into and perform experiments. But also it had a pallet from which we could operate telescopes and other scientific instruments. In this picture, you can see two of my crewmates from my first flight, Doctors Marty Fettman and Ray Seddon. And on this flight, we performed an array of biological and physiological experiments on a number of rats that we had on board and the other lab rats, also known as the crew. But what does the name Space Shuttle really imply? It really implied, and the Space Shuttle really isn't really the formal name of the program. It was the National Space Transportation System. And the idea was it would shuttle people, equipment, material to and from space. Well, if you're going to and from, it's nice to have a destination. And the great concept was that eventually we would have an orbiting laboratory, a space station, to which the space shuttle would fly and return. And we began to take the steps to realize that second piece of the system in the mid-90s when we reached new levels of cooperation with Russia and the Russian Space Agency, and we started flying to the Russian Mir station. There were a total of 11 shuttle flights, 10 of which actually docked to Mir, and 9 of which exchanged crew members. To the right, you see Dr. Shannon Lucid, who was a crewmate of mine on my first flight. Our commander then, John Blaha, described her as the goddess of the universe. On this flight, Shannon spent 188 days in space and set what was then the spaceflight duration record, world record for women. But the shuttle needed to be modified in order to travel to Mir and dock with the Russian space station. It imposed new structural demands on the vehicle. In order to facilitate crew and equipment transfer, we had to have not only structural interface, but also data and electrical interfaces. And we had to successfully demonstrate that in order to initiate construction of the International Space Station. One of the most important things we had to add was an orbiter docking system, an androgynous peripheral attachment system, so that the shuttle and Mir would be compatible. We used essentially the same system in order for the space shuttle to dock with the International Space Station. So I've talked a little bit about the history and the general accomplishments of the space shuttle program. What I would like to do now is relate a few more experiences that are a bit more personal. My second shuttle flight was STS-74, which was the second Mir docking mission. When you first go out to fly, most of us benefit from the fact that we aren't first. And so when you wonder what it's like, someone can describe it to you. But those words can have a profound impact. And I always remember what John Young said as he got on the shuttle for the first time. John, by the way, flew in space 6 times and is one of 12 people to have walked on the moon. He flew on Apollo 16. But John said, anyone who sits on top of the largest hydrogen-oxygen fuel system in the world, knowing that they're going to light the bottom and doesn't get a little worried, does not fully understand the situation. Another way to put it is that you're in a 4.5 million pound vehicle, of which 4 million pounds is somewhat explosive. So, our mission was to install essentially a docking port, the interface for our mission and all subsequent shuttle missions going to Mir. And so we erected it in the payload bay of the space shuttle and then used it as the interface to dock with Mir. It was very successful, and all future missions to Mir attached to the docking mechanism. But there's some fun things on orbit. We learned a little bit about international cooperation and fine cuisine. Maybe it's stretching the truth a little bit to describe space food as fine cuisine. But anyhow, now it's interesting. I find it very interesting. Floating here in the picture are cups of ice cream. So we were going to fly and carry a freezer unit in which we would store frozen biological samples to return to the Earth from Mir. Frozen biological samples, that's code for blood and urine. And we said, well, we're all engineers. We understand how freezers work, and we know that an empty freezer works harder than one that is filled. So we went to the engineers who were going to install the freezer, and we said, we think you should put thermal mass. You should fill the freezer up. And they said, yes, we should. We'll go find something to put in there. And we said, well, could we make a suggestion? And they said, what do you have in mind? We said, ice cream. By the way, if you've ever seen astronaut ice cream, that freeze-dried stuff, it's nasty. It's awful. We wouldn't eat that on a dare. So, real ice cream. And besides, we said the Mir crew. There were 2 Russians and a German on board Mir, and they had been in space for 3 months. They were going to be in space for 3 additional months after we left, and we thought that would just be a wonderful gift to take to them. And so, as you can see, we had a nice meal here on the space shuttle middeck. But if you're going to have a formal banquet, certainly you need live entertainment. And here you can see the space guitar that we took up. And what makes it a space guitar? Well, something that we had no place to stow something that long, so it actually has a hinge right in the middle of the neck so that we could fold it up and put it inside one of our lockers. And You can see the tuning keys down here, and it had and yes, this is an electric guitar. So we're ready for future shuttle missions. And we use those techniques those exact same techniques to begin assembly of the International Space Station. And so on STS-88, you can see that just as we install the docking module onto the airlock in the payload bay, the STS-88 crew installed the Unity node with the two pressurized mating adapters on them. And then they berthed the Russian Zarya Sunrise module right onto the pressurized mating adapter. Now, how do you get ready to go to space? Well, it takes a lot of training on the ground. And what's really important is that the training on the ground be as realistic as possible. In preparation for my third space flight, I'm here in our neutral buoyancy laboratory, the giant indoor pool where we simulate doing spacewalks, and I'm learning how to install a KU band antenna. And here's the same task in space. It was just like being in the water, only more comfortable because I was really floating instead. So it's a couple of 100 kilograms. That's just child's play. One of the most important areas of research when we're in space is trying to understand the effects of the human body. Wow. So what does gravity do to us? We know gravity kind of squishes us down. And if you're in space, you get taller. Kids love that. And I tell them, well, the bad news is when you come back to the ground, you return to your normal height. So how much do I grow in space? About 4 centimeters. Which is kind of important because now you're too long to fit in the same size spacesuit you wore training on the ground is now too short when you're in space. So we have to accommodate that with adjustments in the suit. That's what the International Space Station looks like today. One of the most spectacular opportunities we have in space, though, is to see our lovely home planet. And those of you in the audience are probably quite familiar with this part of the world. Try to focus in a little bit more. It's interesting the variety that our home planet has. This truly is the most fantastic planet in the universe. And what's interesting is you can look out the window and very quickly recognize different places on Earth. So, for example, the deserts in Australia do not look like the Sahara and do not look like the Gobi Desert. And here, as we look at Israel, they're just it's just an interesting opportunity to see how the impact that people have on their environment, where you can see the effects of modern agriculture to take very inhospitable land and make it productive. Unfortunately, this is where my wife and I will have to go on Saturday, Ben Gurion Airport, to return to Houston. But I'll tell you, so far we have loved our visit here. World's pretty at night as well. So I'm sure you recognize Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Amman, Jordan over here. Going a little closer, Tel Aviv. The shuttle fleet, a grand total of 135 missions. The last one ended in July of this past year when Atlantis rolled to a stop for the last time. Mission complete? Hardly. This is just the beginning. My wife and I spent a wonderful afternoon yesterday talking to some of the brightest school children in Israel. As we heard yesterday from the leader of Knesset, space is the future of mankind, and your children believe that. And they, to this day, are still inspired by Colonel Ilan Ramon, Israel's first astronaut. And some of them, I expect, to be fighting to be the first person on Mars. And you have that capability here in your country. But we'll continue operating the space station with current access via the Russian Soyuz spacecraft. NASA is partnering with some commercial firms to develop a next generation of spacecraft to go to the space station. And we're also developing a spacecraft and a rocket to go beyond low Earth orbit, to go further, maybe return to the moon, to an asteroid, eventually Mars. So what's the legacy of the space shuttle? I think the legacy of the space shuttle is that it changed the way we view ourselves in the universe. We are a spacefaring race of people. We're going to wait till all the presenters have finished, and we'll take questions from the audience. But in another context, the questions we're trying to answer by going to space have not been answered yet. Those are how we're going to address the problems of the future. And I would like to leave you with, hopefully, an emotional revisit to the space shuttle.
Slow. VLS is go for main engine start.
Thanks for all the work you did getting this ready to go, and appreciate all your work. And for those watching, get ready to witness the majesty and the power of Discovery as she lifts off one final time.
Bill, thank you very much for sharing with us these wonderful moments and the outstanding presentation. We want to give you a souvenir of staying in Israel, a little bit with higher resolution of the landscape of Israel. Thank you and hope to keep in touch.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. המרצה הבא הוא פרופסור אמריטוס ג'ון לוגסטון, Space Policy Institute, ג'ורג' וושינגטון University. לפני שעזב את תפקידו הפעיל באוניברסיטה והפך לפרופסור אמריטוס, ב-2008 הוא שימש חבר סגל כפרופסור מלא 38 שנים. הוא גם היה המייסד והמנהל של ה-Space Policy Institute באוניברסיטת ג'ורג' וושינגטון, ובשנים האקדמיות 2007-2008 היה גם Distinguished Visiting Professor באוניברסיטת MIT. את התואר הראשון שלו הוא עשה בפיזיקה ב-1960, ואת הדוקטורט ב-Political Science ב-1970. פרופסור לוגסטון כתב מאמרים רבים מאוד על מדיניות חלל, וגם שורה של ספרים בנושאי חלל. הוא מופיע בפורומים שונים בעולם בנושאי חלל ומדיניות חלל. הוא גם חבר הסגל של אוניברסיטת החלל הבינלאומית, ISU, וגם שירת בוועדות רבות מאוד של הממשל האמריקאי. פרופסור לוגסטון, please. Okay, the podium is yours.
Good morning. Like everyone else that has been up here, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here, and have to thank the Fisher Institute, the Israeli Space Agency, all the organizers for making it possible. In the entertainment business, there's a kind of rule that one should never follow an act that has either a dog or a child. I think in the space business, one should never follow an astronaut with movies. And here I am trying to do that. My assigned role is to do a somewhat independent assessment of the space shuttle program, positives and negatives, and I will try to do that in a balanced fashion. This image is of the launch of STS-98 in February 2001. I happened to be at that launch, and it was remarkably, as you can see, beautiful, with the setting sun in the west capturing reflections off of the contrail of the shuttle, and the rising full moon in the east having this kind of telescopic effect on a different part of the contrail. There's no doubt that the shuttle was a remarkable human and technological achievement, and whatever else one can say about it, the fact that we did it is remarkable. I'm also familiar that repetition is a good teaching tool, and so a few of the things I have to say, Bill MacArthur has already said. There were 135 missions of the shuttle. 4 of them were test flights. The first 4 were 2-person crews with ejection seats. And then the decision was made that the shuttle was safe enough not to require escape systems, and so it flew the rest of its missions without any onboard escape systems. It was the ability to come back and land safely that was its basic abort mode. Certainly one of the most complex machines that humans have ever built, with 2.5 million separate parts. The number of people carried into orbit by the shuttle, because it could carry an up to 7-person crew, was very impressive. The ratio between male and female, not quite, I guess, what the female half of the world would like, but it was progress. And traveled 59 million miles. It's a lot of frequent flyer miles. Some of these slides, by the way, are just good excuses to put some of my favorite shuttle pictures on. One of the things that people forget is that at its origin, the shuttle was going to be used by the national security community. And up until the time of the Challenger accident and a little bit afterwards, shuttle did carry some classified missions in addition to the NASA and commercial missions. It was a precedent for international cooperation. Apollo was by design a unilateral demonstration of American technological and managerial competence. Once we had won, the United States, had won the race to the moon, the decision was made by the Nixon administration in 1969 and 70 that the next big program, whatever it might be, should be open to international involvement, and that program turned out to be the shuttle, and it was indeed open to international participation in terms of hardware, with the beautifully labeled Canada arm and the Space Lab, and people from 16 countries other than the United States went to space aboard the shuttle. It did serve, I think continues to serve, as an example of American patriotism, of pride. For our symbolism, probably it's the American flag, the bald eagle, our national bird, and then some sort of space image. And a shuttle launch is one of those iconic space images. All very positive contributions. It was a technological marvel. It was a grand technological accomplishment. Bill said some of this. Images in different thermal regions. You can see the heating on the wings and the nose in these images. He passed over it rather quickly. Over half of the mass put into orbit for all of the space age up to 2010 was carried to orbit by the shuttle. It really was a truck, which in its essence was what the shuttle was intended to be. Orbited the great observatories, Hubble, Compton, and Chandra, launched the Galileo probe to Jupiter and Magellan to Venus, had a variety of Earth-oriented scientific activities with radar and other sensors pointed back at the home planet. The photographs not only excite us, but also gave lots of information about the home planet. Space Lab was a surrogate space station until the full-up space station got built. A number of microgravity experiments were carried out aboard the Space Lab element of the space shuttle. There were other parts than the pressurized laboratory. I think in order to understand my evaluation of the shuttle anyway, you have to have some history. My inclination is to base my thinking on history. So let's run rather quickly through the history of the shuttle because I think it tells you a fair amount. The idea that you shouldn't throw away a rocket every time you launched into space has been around a long time. You see the image from the movie 2001 of a shuttle run by Pan American Airlines going up to a space station run by Hilton Hotel. Hilton's still here, but Pan Am certainly is not. NASA in 1969, in the wake of the Apollo 11 lunar landing, was faced with setting the priority for what it wanted to do after Apollo. And it set out a grand plan that included missions to Mars in the 1980s, and lunar bases and transportation systems in space between Earth orbit and other destinations. But its core first step was a 12-person space station to be launched on the Saturn V, the Apollo Saturn launch vehicle, 33 feet across. The current station's 14 feet across, so about over twice as big. 12-person, and then quickly 50, and eventually within 10 or 15 years, 100 persons living in space on a long-duration basis. And in order to service that space station, there was a need for a logistics vehicle, something to go back and forth between Earth and the space station, a shuttle. And that's where the shuttle concept emerged in NASA's post-Apollo thinking. There were some visionaries within NASA that said there are many other uses of that capability, but the core argument was you need a shuttle to service a space station. One problem, the Nixon administration didn't want to approve a space station and made that clear in 1970. And so NASA had only one project left on its post-Apollo agenda, which was the shuttle. And during 1971, more or less reinvented a reason to develop this vehicle, and the reinvention was it would be all things to all people. It would launch a variety of payloads, civilian. Commercial wasn't very much a part of the calculation at that point, but military and national security, I guess one now can say intelligence satellites, were very much a part of it. And so the shuttle was redesigned in 1971 to be able to launch the then planned generation of intelligence satellites, which meant it was mission 3A, I believe, in Bill's thing, the ability to launch over the pole from the west coast of the United States, do a flight once around, and then maneuver cross-range and land where it took off. While the Earth had rotated for 90 minutes, something like 1,100 miles eastward. That defined the length of the payload bay. The width of the payload bay, 15 feet, was defined primarily by NASA's desire to come back to the space station, this time on a modular basis, once the shuttle was developed. And the calculation was that no one would be willing to live long durations in a module less than 14 feet wide. So the payload bay had to accommodate a module of that size. You see there were lots of designs considered in about a 6-month period in 1971, all designed to a budget ceiling. The White House, the then Office of Management and Budget, said, we may approve this program, but if we do, you can figure only on $5 billion for its development. NASA had been planning on $10 billion. Ultimately, a decision was made over New Year's weekend, 1971-72, to go ahead with the shuttle, and indeed to go ahead with the largest shuttle design that NASA was proposing. Why? Well, there's a funny mixture of motivations. One was to keep humans flying, American humans flying in space. A second was to create and continue and maintain the image of American strength symbolized by the space program. And the third was President Nixon was coming up for re-election in 1972 and wanted to make sure that in key election states there were aerospace jobs. And folks I've talked to as I've done my own work on this suggest that that last consideration was very important in the final decision to go ahead. Politics permeates almost all government decisions. This shouldn't be so surprising. Neatly sidestepped was any decision on the goal of the U.S. space program, because a shuttle is a means. It's a transportation system. It's a truck. It doesn't say what you're going to use it for, just that there are going to be multiple uses. But that decision announced January 5th, 1972, so 40 years ago, put the shuttle at the center of U.S. space activity until the middle of last year. We'll come back to whether that was a good public policy decision or not. I tend to think it was not. One of the my credentials for being up here was I was in 2003 a member of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. And so myself and the other 12 members of the board spent a lot of time thinking about, talking about, looking at the shuttle and the shuttle program in 6 months between February and August of 2003. I think the report we issued was a very good report. I still stand by it. You can read what it said, that the inherent in the shuttle that was approved was a level of complexity that carried its own risks into the future. And that from the very start, the shuttle, because it was so ambitious, because it tried to be all things to all people, was an inherently risky vehicle. As Bill MacArthur said, the shuttle started flying a couple of years late, which wasn't bad for the development program, particularly a complex development program. And in space terms, it came in pretty close to budget for its development costs. Maybe 20% overrun, which, say, in space terms isn't bad. 4 test flights and then started operation. First launch, STS-5, first operational launch, launched 2 communication satellites, quickly flew the space lab, retrieved satellites from space. This is the for sale sign down on the bottom saying we've got them, we'll bring them back, somebody else wants to buy them. Went into competition in a kind of mercantile way with the European Ariane for launch contracts, offering to launch communication satellites well below cost in order to compete with Europe, particularly with France. We didn't like very much the idea of French-built rocket, European rocket, taking away U.S. business. And by 1984, the shuttle was deemed safe enough to think about flying non-professional astronauts. The first contest was for a teacher in space. Second was a journalist in space. 2 politicians, Senator Jake Garn, Representative Bill Nelson, more or less forced their way onto the shuttle for flights. And the plan at that point was to build up the flight rate to 24 a year. It sounds now pretty ambitious. 9 flights in 1985, the most ever. Then came Challenger, rather brutal wake-up call. The vehicle was launched in cold Florida weather in January. What was it now? It was January the 26th of 86, so 25 years ago, last week. The vehicle came apart, the fuel ignited, and the crew were killed, including teacher Krista McAuliffe. Lots of impacts of that accident. This picture is one that very few of you, I think, have ever seen or maybe thought about. This is the West Coast launch site for the shuttle, which was built and ready for use. This was a test model, the Enterprise, checking it out for fit. This was the one that was going to fly the classified intelligence missions into polar orbits, built at the cost of multiple billions of dollars and never used. The Air Force was able to convince the White House to switch intelligence satellites to an expendable vehicle and not depend on the shuttle. The White House also said the shuttle would no longer be used to launch commercial payloads, that the cost-benefit ratio, including the risks, said that was no longer a good idea, even though it was part of the basic philosophy of the system. And from Challenger on, essentially, the shuttle launched only NASA missions. There were a couple of residual national security missions where the spacecraft had been designed so it could only be launched on the shuttle, and they were launched. But fundamentally, from 1988, return to flight on, the shuttle was a NASA launch vehicle, not a national launch vehicle. The space station was approved as planned. As soon as the shuttle started flying, NASA sought approval for the space station, got it from President Reagan in 1984. President Reagan said the station will be ready within a decade, but by the early 90s, no station hardware had been built. The program had gone through redesigns and uncertain budget futures. It was used to launch the Hubble and to repair the Hubble. As relations with the former Soviet Union thawed and the notion of getting an early start on experience of long-duration spaceflight, as Bill MacArthur said, the shuttle docked with Mir. Ultimately, or finally, after bringing Russia into the space station program and therefore saving the program, I think, from cancellation, the shuttle launched the first U.S. elements of the space station in December of 1998, with the first crew of now a continuous stream of over 11 years of permanent crewing of the station, Expedition 1 starting in November of, it says here, March of 2001. I think that's wrong. First shuttle launch crew, yeah. Bill Shepard went up on Soyuz, yeah. From NASA's point of view, the fundamental reason to have a shuttle was to build a space station, in my view. And finally, it got to do that. And with 37 flights, lots of EVAs, remarkable engineering achievement to put this facility together. How many of you have seen the station as it's flown across in the sky? Not a few, but not that many. Something you should do. It's a -3 object, a very bright object, and to look up there and say, there are 6 people up there living and working, doing research in space is something to think about and I think feel very positive about. One of the problems in the history of the shuttle was the assumption from the start that it could be routine. That was part of the rhetoric surrounding its approval. After the Challenger accident and the shuttle returned to flight, there was in the mid-90s an attempt again to treat it as a routine system. The fabled flight controller Chris Kraft headed a team that issued a report in 1995 talking about it's a mature and reliable system, about as safe as today's technology will provide. Maybe yet not. Certainly the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, that's NASA's top safety advisory panel, didn't think so at the time. And we on the Columbia board, and I think the most damning couple of sentences in our report are these sentences quoted on the bottom of this slide that said that NASA was not operating the shuttle as safely as was possible and as was necessary, and wasn't getting White House or congressional support or the resources needed to operate the shuttle safely. Columbia, clearly one of the reasons we're here today. This was a mission that NASA did not want to fly. The science community forced it on NASA because NASA was focused on assembly of the space station. Lots of launch delays. We all know what happened. The Columbia Board report is rather graphic and specific on how the knowledge of the foam strike didn't make any difference in the way the mission was managed. 8 separate opportunities to be aware of the foam strike with nothing happening. And so we got the result we got. We identified the technical cause of the failure, but also saw it as a organizational, political, historical failure that was somehow inherent in the way the program was being run. Our report came out in August of 2003. Between then and December 2003, there was a debate of whether to return the shuttle to flight. The ultimate decision was obviously to return it to flight, primarily because of the international commitments to our space station partners. We called on the Columbia board the fact that there was no replacement then for the shuttle a failure of national leadership. Here we are 9 years later, 8.5 years later, still with no replacement for the shuttle, still a failure of national leadership in my view. I think the final two managers of the shuttle program, Wayne Hale and John Shannon, did a really excellent job of operating the system so that when STS-135 touched down last July, it was the safest that the shuttle has been throughout its history. But it's embarrassing that we have to now fly temporarily, I hope, to the station where we are the managing partner using taxi services provided by another country. What happens to the shuttles? Well, they become museum pieces. In fact, I saw a notice coming over here a couple of days ago that Discovery arrives at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington on April the 19th because there's a ready-made place for it to be exhibited as Enterprise has moved out. As Bill said, there are, I think, 15 remaining Space Shuttle main engines. They've been put into storage at Stennis Space Center and are intended to be used for the early versions of the large heavy lift vehicle that is just beginning development. I'll talk about that in the second talk today. So how do you bookkeep all of this? There were a lot of promises made, particularly at the start of the shuttle program. Shuttle was going to revolutionize transportation by routinizing it. Well, never became routine. The shuttle was, even at its last flight, still an experimental vehicle requiring extreme and expensive care to operate safely. It would never be able to operate routinely in the aircraft kind of mode that was the mental image. NASA told the White House, as the shuttle was approved, it would cost in 1972 $10 million a flight. The actual price of a shuttle flight is an art. Calculating that is an art that's beyond my capability because you can do it in about 100 different ways. So I do it dumb. The whole cost of the program divided by the number of flights. And the development and operations of the shuttle over its 40 years, from approval to final flight, was $209 billion in last year's dollars. That adds up to $1.6 billion a flight, or 1.55. Certainly, by whatever metric, it was a lot more than $10 million a flight. And the shuttle became a kind of mortgage on the rest of the program because the top-line budget was level, and it became impossible to start anything significant new with still paying the bill of operating shuttle and building an operating station. I think one of the main reasons for retiring shuttle was to free up that money for investment in future programs. The economics of the shuttle projected 33 to 55 launches a year. The most launches were 9. Most launches after Columbia was 5. So there's clearly a gap between promise and reality, and how you evaluate that gap is an important question. What's the summary? Was the program a failure? In terms of its promises, probably yes. In terms of its accomplishments compared to its cost, not easy to make a judgment. In terms of its impact of keeping the United States in low Earth orbit over the past 40 years, I think it would have been better to have retired the shuttle, would have been better to have done the station on its original schedule, used the shuttle to build it, and then retired it. But we didn't do that. But was it an accomplishment of which the United States can be very justifiably proud? I think the answer is a resounding yes. So I come up with my assessment of the shuttle as being mixed, and I'm glad it's behind us and it's time to get started on something new. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Logston. You know, as the initiator of the Israeli space program 34 years ago, we always looked up to the U.S. space program as, like it said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we want to give you a souvenir.
Thank you.
And hope to keep in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
ולסיום המושב הזה ישנם שני מרצים שידברו על הנושא מחקרים ביו-רפואיים על מעבורת החלל ותחנת החלל. ג'פרי ממבר, מנכ"ל ננורקס, ארצות הברית, ודוקטור ערן שנקר, ראש המרכז לרפואת תעופה וחלל, מכון פישר. ג'ף ממבר משלים 3 עשורים של ניסיון בנושאי שוק החלל המסחרי. הוא הקים ופיתח את ננורקס וגם את ציוד המחקר שלה כחלק של המעבדה הלאומית האמריקאית על תחנת החלל הבינלאומית. כיום החברה מטפלת בלמעלה מ-50 מתעדים שונים לממשלות שונות בעולם, והחברה מוכרת כמובילה בשירותי מסחר בחלל במסלולים נמוכים. לפני ננורקס, ג'ף יעץ לחברת פנאמסאט בנושאי תקשורת שעברו בהמשך לאינטלסאט, ופיתח בוול סטריט קרן מיוחדת לנושאי חלל בלבד, מה שאנחנו מקווים לעשות פה בארץ עם התוכנית הלאומית. ג'ף סייע גם ליצירת החוזים המסחריים בין חברת מיר הרוסית לחברה אמריקאית. הוא טיפל בחוזים הראשונים בין נאסא לסוכנות החלל הרוסית וגם יוזמות נוספות של שיתופי פעולה עם רוסיה. הוא כתב מספר ספרים ושורה ארוכה של מאמרים. הוא גם חבר במכון פישר שמארח אותנו כאן, והוא גם קיבל פרס על שם לויד ברקנר מטעם האמריקן אסטרונוטיקל סוסייטי בשנת 2011. Jeff, please.
Thank you, Professor. Good morning, everybody. It's really a privilege to be here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed seeing Israel for the first time and seeing how alive the community and how beautiful the weather, I suppose I could also say. And I want to thank the Fisher Institute and the Ministry of Science and Technology for giving NanoRacks the opportunity to be here today. We want to change a little bit. Our discussion this morning is also on the shuttle. It's about some of the work that we helped do with the Fisher Institute on STS-134 and 135, and Dr. Shanker will talk about that. What I want to do is look forward as well and talk about utilization. And we've been listening for the last day and this morning, looking at astronomy, looking at politics, looking at satellites, looking at history of the shuttle program. What I want to do this morning is talk about utilization and how do we work in space. And NanoRacks is a new sort of company. It's a company that's been founded by the core team, and we invested our funds and we launched into space not having any government contracts or any government funding. Now, in any other business, you might say that's normal. But it's not normal in the space business. In the space business, the normal way things are done is that you respond to the government. The government says, here's something we want to do, and you put in a proposal and see if you win to get the government contracts. We did something differently, and we follow, and in the whole debate in the United States and in the space community today is how do we get more commercial? How do we legitimately get more commercial? And for us, we decided that we saw a niche market. We saw that people were not using the space station now that it was completed fully. They were not commercial users. And we said, wait a second, rather than going to NASA and seeking funds, we put up our money, designed some research platforms, which I'll show you, went out and marketed the station. In our first year, we've only been around about 15 months now. We've gotten schools and universities, federal agencies, the National Institute of Health. We've signed a 3-year contract with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We're flying a Vietnamese project. We're flying something from Germany. And we've flown twice the Fisher Institute. And you see a picture here of the late load of the biological payloads that was the Fisher Institute project on 134. And what we're most proud of is the fact that we've been averaging, from the time you sign a contract to launch, about 9 months. And in the NASA world, that's pretty good. That's pretty fast. But what is commercial space? And from my vantage point, commercial space means the government serves as a customer and not a competitor to the private sector. And what do I mean by competitor? In low Earth orbit, there is really principally no reason for a government agency today to be designing, developing, and operating the hardware. And we feel, and a growing number of people in the space community feel, that that can be done in a commercial sense with investors and entrepreneurs and commercial organizations putting their money at risk and having a space agency as a customer. And the present administration has agreed, and the key word in this long quote is buying the services. In other words, again, not having the government, not having NASA involved in low Earth orbit in the design and development and operation of a particular piece of hardware. It's not just the United States. Here's a quote from the former head of Roscosmos saying, hey, we should be doing what the Americans are doing because it's getting awfully expensive. And so so you see that it's international. It's changing the way the space community is behaving, especially in low Earth orbit. And finally, let me just say that at NanoRacks, we believe that if you keep the cost low enough and you make it easy enough to get to space, we'll see in space what we've seen also in the internet and the software business, that you know what? Sometimes it's not just PhDs that have great ideas. Sometimes you'll get a 17-year-old kid who comes up with something, and already we've flown 21 school districts in the States, and I was telling someone yesterday, I only understand about 60% of the projects we're flying for these high school students. So it's unbelievable, excuse me, the creativity that you can get even from young people today. And in terms of Israeli-American cooperation, we think the commercial path allows rapid utilization of space program resources, and it keeps the politics out. I mean, here we are, a company, we've signed with Saudi Arabia, we've signed with Vietnam, we've worked with Israel, and you don't get the politics that you get when it's governments working together. So what have we done? We're an add-on to the U.S. National Lab. As you may know, Congress declared several years ago that the NASA portion of the International Space Station would be a United States national lab. So we went ahead and we developed 2 platforms. And each platform has 16 slots. And I think if I can go backwards here, let me see. we put the film, the video. Okay, let me see if this. Oops. There's no sound to this. This is in the Japanese module, and this is an astronaut working on one of our platforms, and he's going to be putting in one of our payloads. There's one of the platforms, very small, very simple, and you see that the payloads, which we call nanolabs, are plugged into the platform. And as soon as they're plugged in, the power is flowing from the station, and the data, the payload is activated inside the nanolab, and the data flows down to the mission control on the ground. And so here he is checking the computer. And there's a payload. And despite it being in a plastic wrap, it's an extremely sophisticated project. It has video camera in there. It has circuit boards. It's able to do some pretty sophisticated research. And this is in the Japanese module. We have 2 platforms in the Japanese module, and we'll have other projects in the Destiny, the American module. And here is the complex moment when a NanoRacks payload is activated. There, it's activated. And we call this the ultimate plug and play. And everything we've done is to try and keep it as simple as possible so that we can keep the cost down, so that you can get greater utilization. And we do that when it's your funds, when your money at risk. Okay, let me see. Okay. So that's another view. Also, we've put up microscopes. It's kind of amazing, but after the money that we've spent on International Space Station, we discovered that there were no simple-to-use microscopes. So we've put up the first 2 microscopes on the station. We also have a sophisticated device coming called the plate reader, which will allow more and more analysis in space. We're going to have a 3rd platform for biopharmaceutical, and an external platform, very interesting for materials and sensor development. All of this we're self-funding except for the plate reader. Everything else, we are taking the risk, putting in the funds, and NASA is assisting us by giving us launch opportunities, being our landlord, and to me that's the proper relationship as we move forward between the government and the commercial sector. This is an old slide, but just quick. This is the situation when we flew with the Fisher Institute. But you see that today it's really remarkable. With the agreements that NASA has in place, we can fly with the Progress, the Russian. We can fly with SpaceX. We can fly with the Japanese. We can fly with the French. And so finally we have an era today of routine, as much as space can be routine, access to space, unmanned, because you're flying on multiple vehicles. And so to finish my part of the presentation, how can we move so fast? We believe we can move so fast because it's commercial. And what does commercial mean? It means that the NASA is allowing a company to handle the payload development, the design of the hardware. NASA's not coming in and saying to us, hey, this is what the platform has to look like. We have no committees. We sit down, we come up with the design, and NASA's trusting it's a good design because our funding is at stake. It's our change. And we still have to go through the safety reviews. We still have to meet all safety requirements, but NASA's beginning to realize that the private sector is capable, in low Earth orbit, in things that are known, to behave as would any commercial company. And so also being commercial means the IP, the intellectual property, is proprietary. I really don't know what the Fisher Institute has done. I'm going to learn, like you today, some of the results. We had to submit to the safety board, but beyond that, the Fisher Institute was able to keep proprietary their projects, and that is new. And there's this tug with NASA. They want to publish as much as possible to show off good results, and we as a private company want to keep it quiet as much as possible. From my side, in conclusion, what do we see as the next few years? The International Space Station is a truly magnificent structure in space. The U.S. National Lab is open for business. I think we're finally going to discover if the absence of gravity does achieve breakthroughs in biopharmaceutical, in medicine, in understanding certain properties of chemicals that cannot be done on the Earth. The external platform should be of interest on electronics testing, sensor development, and we hope that with NanoRacks and other organizations and companies like us, it will truly be a time when the era of utilization of low Earth orbit has begun. And now what I'd like to do is turn it over to Dr. Schenker, who will discuss, I hope, the results that he's got, and I'm as interested as you to hear what it is. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Jeff, I want to thank you. And we'll need at the Israeli Space Agency your advice, because we promised the Treasury to come up with return on investment as soon as possible. Yeah. So your advice will be very helpful. Thank you. That's a souvenir of your stay. ומסיים את המושב דוקטור ערן שנקר, ראש המחקר לחקר רפואת תעופה וחלל מכון פישר. דוקטור שנקר קיבל השכלה אקדמית כרופא בישראל, הוא בוגר הפקולטה לרפואה באוניברסיטת בן גוריון, לתואר שני הוא למד ברקנטי באוניברסיטת תל אביב, ועסק בהנהלת מערכות בריאות. הוא שימש כסמנכ"ל פיתוח עסקי רפואי בחברות ביוטכנולוגיה, ועסק גם בעבודה קלינית מול מערכות ממוחשבות לניטור פעילות הלב והנשימה באולם הבקרה של נאס"א, ובנוסף הוא ביצע ניסויים רפואיים בביוטכנולוגיה על נגזרות של תרופות חדשות במעבורות החלל, בתמיכת משרד הבריאות, משרד המדע וסוכנות החלל הישראלית. ערן, בבקשה.
Thank you, and I'm really honored to be in this session. I think without Bill and his astronaut colleagues, I wouldn't be able to put any of my research on any of a space vehicle. Without my professor-teacher, John, that actually I think injected the drug, the space drug, in ISU, I wouldn't be addicted to space. And without actually Jeff, we wouldn't do 2 missions in 2012, actually 11, and results of 12. So let's start with really what Fisher in Israel have been done in life sciences. We have been in 5 space missions, 4 different space shuttles. We have done activities with 3 space agencies, and last year 2 missions on Endeavour and actually Atlantis. And we've been once on space station as well. We started actually more than 15 years ago with the sponsor of the Israeli Space Agency and the Health Ministry with STS-80 in 1996 with early development of embryo in microgravity. We have continued on STS-95 on 1998 with new medications for calcium loss in space and osteoporosis. Then on STS-107 Columbia mission on 2003, we have tried to work on probiotics of milk formulation as we are from the Holy Land of a country of milk and honey. We've continued last year on STS-134 with a continuous study of bone cell study, and just lately with Atlantis on a water Israeli technology for desertification. The first actually study on STS-80 was with the Hadassah Hebrew University, with the University of Manitoba, Canada, and the Canadian Space Agency, with the Israel Space Agency and others, and ISU. We wanted, as a gynecologist in my background, to see if we can produce only on Earth. if we can actually take and reproduce in other countries, in other kind of planets, or in microgravity. Unfortunately, we exposed the microgravity embryo and we failed to exceed any development stages. It looks like we will have to reproduce still on Earth if we want to continue from generation to generation. We have done a study, see how we go up here, with the Canadian Space Agency on bone. And these findings have been that indicated that space-induced osteoporosis can be minimized by administrations of vitamin D. So we took that on another study, advanced one, with one of the Israeli famous pharmaceutical company, and developed an analog of vitamin D that you can actually put on the cells and to see the advantage, and that's what has been happening. On Columbia, unfortunately, we wanted to, preliminary questions was to whether or not bacteria can survive in space. Do probiotics bacteria change in space? And are probiotics bacteria safe to conceptions in space? And what we found out that it's not so simple. The design to taking bacteria into space, that astronauts are kind of evolving with them, that could be pathogenic in a way, we should have been developing, and we developed a special hardware, a suit that can not only that the bacteria can survive, but they could be protected and safe. This hardware actually was one of 400 studies on board the shuttle. This is actually the two crew members of Columbia on the last day. And this is the last day of the Columbia mission, which everything looks fine. We concluded the study, one of 400. But as you know, we could not get the data. This is how we sent that on January 16, 2003, and from 400, 9 survived. And the Israeli study has been recovered in the debris. When I've seen that, I says, no way we can do any science of that. But for the legacy of Ilan Mamon and the staff and the crew of Columbia, we decided to come back to Cape Canaveral, build a lab, and try to recover. And we were happy to find 100% of the probiotic milk powder sample recovered. We compared them back in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem and in other places around the world, and we found actually that there were normal healthy living cultures comparing to the ground. So it's safe to take the study. We went into more advanced electrical and microscopic imaging on the post-flight, and we found the same. So we know now that actually this is something we would like to continue. When NASA heard that from 400 studies, 9 survived, they says, you know, we're going to finish, to conclude, to summarize the era of the shuttle. Maybe you will come back and do the study again and other studies. And that's actually what we have done. On STS-134, we didn't do only this one, but actually with the Israeli Space Agency and the Ministry of Science, we took not only musculoskeletal systems and immune systems and reproductive system study, but we decided to study the effect of microgravity on the genome, on the gene, on expression during space travel. So this was hard. We had to prepare, not in 4 years, in a very short time, with a payload and hardware that we didn't have. And with Jeff and Anorak, actually, we've been able in 45 days of hard work to be on time, as you can see on the pictures, with actually the hardware that will go into space. But more than that, we decided that it will stay in space station. And after takeoff, just after takeoff, when STS-134 arrived to station, we got an answer, do you want to do it again in 30 days? To go on Atlantis, the last mission. And this is the way you can do when you do commercial. You do very great science, and you can work as Israelis. Let's replan everything, sit together, and have another study with a different merit, with a different science approach. So we took actually not only our science, but took other Israelis' industry. And this is the water desalination, extreme environment. We want to see if actually NASA and others have a problem on maintaining clear water, safe water. Treating drinking water is one of the major challenges in developing regions all over the world. It's actually a continuous global problem of our civilization, especially in dealing with microgravity or microbiological contaminations, not only microgravity on Earth as well. Understanding this mechanism and bacterial response is very important. And we have done. We took it on STS-134 in July, last July. As you can see the pictures on board. It was a very simple way to take an Israeli industry with the Israeli technology of making water clear, put it in a tube, mix them with the bacteria, and look if we can actually maintain the clear water. This is a NanoRack hardware just before it went up into space. It stayed on the space station. We have done the study with the astronauts in a very clear and simple way. Speaking earlier, if you can watch the space station, this is actually a picture, I'm happy I kind of dropped in, of the moon just from this month, and space station moving, kind of flying by. Now, not flying by the moon, and you can see the size because it's only 300 miles from here. But this is like picture after pictures of the station on the background of the moon.